The Price of Empire, Rudyard Kipling and the Futility of War. There is a particular tragedy in discovering the truth of war only after sending someone you love into it. Rudyard Kipling had spent much of his literary life giving voice to the British Empire. He celebrated its soldiers, its frontiers, its sense of duty and sacrifice. In barrack room ballads, he gave the ordinary Imperial soldier a memorable voice, while in The White Man's Burden, he articulated the Victorian conviction that empire carried a civilizing mission. Whatever complexities and contradictions existed within Kipling's imperial vision, he was unmistakably one of its most powerful literary champions. Then, the empire asked him for his son. John Kipling was 18 years old when he went to France. Poor eyesight had initially prevented him from entering military service, but his father's influence helped secure him a commission in the Irish Guards. John was eager to fight. He arrived in France on his 18th birthday and, only weeks later, was sent into the Battle of Loos. The battle became a disaster. On September 27, 1915, amid the machine gun fire and confusion of the battlefield, John disappeared. His body was never recovered. For Kipling, the war suddenly ceased to be an abstraction. The empire was no longer an idea on a map. It was no longer a phrase about duty, civilization, sacrifice, or destiny. It had become an empty place where his son had vanished. For years, Kipling searched for John. He questioned survivors, appealed to military authorities, contacted the Red Cross, and pursued every fragment of information that might tell him what had happened. But eventually, there was nothing left to discover. His son was dead. And here lies the terrible irony of Kipling's story. The man who had spent his life giving poetic meaning to imperial sacrifice was forced to confront its most intimate consequence. He had not merely watched a generation go to war, he had helped send his own child toward it. He had to confront the possibility that he had sacrificed one of the great loves of his life, his son, to another great love, the British Empire. The realization seems almost unbearable. The Empire and the Father. Before Loos, Kipling could write about sacrifice from the elevated distance of the poet and imperial believer. After Loos, sacrifice had a face. It was John's face. The transformation in Kipling's writing was therefore not simply political, it was existential. The confident language of imperial purpose increasingly gave way to grief, bitterness, remembrance, and an awareness of the terrible distance between the language of war and the reality experienced by those who lose their sons. The most devastating expression of this transformation comes in the poem, Common Form. If any question why we died, tell them, because our fathers lied. The word fathers is devastating. It can mean the literal fathers who raised the young men. It can mean the political fathers who governed them. It can mean the generation that inherited power and sent the younger generation to die. And, inevitably, it can be heard as an accusation against Kipling himself. The man who had urged a generation toward imperial duty had become, through the death of his own son, part of the generation forced to ask whether the stories told about war had been lies. The line is therefore more than an anti-war statement. It is an elegy for a broken inheritance. The fathers promised meaning, the sons received death. Who shall return us the children? Kipling's grief became the grief of an entire generation. In the children, he asked, "But who shall return us the children?" That question reaches beyond John Kipling. Millions of young men had disappeared into the trenches. Some returned physically broken. Many never returned at all. Behind each missing soldier stood a mother, a father, a wife, a brother, a sister, or a child who would grow up knowing someone only through photographs and stories. The rhetoric of empire could speak of sacrifice, but it could not resurrect the dead. This is where Kipling's tragedy acquires its full elegiac force. He had once been one of the great voices capable of making imperial service appear meaningful and heroic. Now he was writing in the shadow of an irreversible fact. No political ideal is powerful enough to bargain with death. John could not be returned. No victory could restore him. No empire could compensate for his absence. My Boy Jack. The emotional core of Kipling's grief is perhaps most powerfully captured in My Boy Jack. The poem speaks through uncertainty and waiting. There is no triumphant battlefield. There is no imperial spectacle. There is simply a father asking whether his boy has been found. And the answer never arrives. The repeated phrase, "not this tide," becomes almost unbearable because it expresses the cruel suspension between hope and knowledge. Perhaps he will return. Perhaps there is still news. Perhaps the next tide will bring him home. But it does not. The poem eventually arrives at the quiet consolation. He did not shame his kind. Even here, the old Kipling is still faintly present. The language of duty and honour has not completely disappeared, but something fundamental has changed. Honour is no longer enough. Glory is no longer enough. Patriotism is no longer enough. A dead son remains dead. From empire to memory, Kipling did not suddenly become an enemy of Britain, nor did he simply abandon every belief he had once held. His transformation was more complicated, and therefore more human. He continued to serve the memory of the soldiers who had died. He became deeply involved with the Imperial War Graves Commission and helped shape the commemorative landscape of the Western Front. He contributed to the history of the Irish Guards, the regiment in which John had served. And among the most enduring phrases associated with the war graves is, "known unto God." There is something profoundly moving in this. Kipling helped give words to the graves of men whose identities had been lost. Yet he himself never knew exactly where his own son had died or what had become of his body. The father who searched for one missing boy became one of the custodians of memory for hundreds of thousands of unknown dead. It is almost as though Kipling's private grief expanded until it encompassed an entire cemetery. The unknown soldier became, in some sense, every soldier, and every grave became a reminder of John, the elegy of the imperial dream. Kipling's tragedy is not simply that he lost his son. It is that the death of his son changed the meaning of everything he had previously believed. Before the war, empire could be imagined through maps, uniforms, ceremonies, heroic narratives, and the language of duty. After Loos, the imperial dream had acquired a grave, and behind that grave stood a father. This is why Kipling's later relationship with war is so poignant. He did not need to become a pacifist to understand its horror. He did not need to reject Britain to recognise the terrible cost of political ambition. His own experience had already destroyed the comfortable distance between patriotic rhetoric and human suffering. The war had taught him something that perhaps no argument could have taught him. War is not an abstraction. It is a son who does not come home. It is a mother waiting at a window. It is a father searching through lists of the missing. It is a name that never appears. It is a grave marked only by uncertainty. And sometimes it is a famous writer standing among thousands of graves, helping to find words for the dead while knowing that the one grave he wanted most to find might never be found, because our fathers lied. Perhaps that is why the line from Common Form carries such extraordinary weight. Tell them, because our fathers lied. It is tempting to read the word lied simply as an accusation against governments and military leaders, but Kipling's biography makes the line more complicated. The fathers had believed their own language. They believed in duty. They believed in honour. They believed in empire. They believed that sacrifice could be transformed into meaning. And then the sons died. The terrible question was not merely whether the fathers had deliberately deceived the young, it was whether an entire civilization had deceived itself. Perhaps Kipling's mature tragedy lies precisely here. The Imperial poet discovered the limits of Imperial language. There are words, empire, glory, duty, civilization, honor, that can sound magnificent when spoken from a distance, but none of them can answer a father standing beside an empty chair. None can explain why an 18-year-old boy lies somewhere beneath the soil of France. None can return him. The man who finally saw War Kipling had once helped Britain imagine war. Then war entered his own house. That is the central tragedy. The man who had championed imperial duty was forced to discover what duty could demand from an individual family. The empire that had once appeared immense and majestic suddenly seemed strangely powerless before the death of one young man. Perhaps this is what makes Kipling's later work more than a simple repudiation of his earlier beliefs. It is an elegy written from inside the dream. He did not stand outside the empire and condemn it. He had believed in it. He had served it with his pen. His son had served it with his life. And then the father was left with the silence. That silence is perhaps the real subject of Kipling's later poetry. Not victory, not defeat, not even empire. Absence, the absence of a son, the absence of a body, the absence of certainty. The absence left behind when a civilization discovers that its grandest words cannot contain the human cost of its ambitions. And so, the story of Rudyard Kipling and John Kipling becomes, unintentionally, one of the great elegies of the First World War. A father who had given poetry to empire was forced to write poetry for the dead. A man who had spoken of sacrifice was forced to experience it. A champion of imperial glory was confronted with the battlefield's most unforgiving truth. No empire, however vast, can give back the dead. And perhaps, in the end, the most haunting voice is not that of the imperial poet who once called men to duty, but that of the grieving father who finally understood what those calls could cost. If any question why we died, tell them, because our fathers lied. The thunder of empire had promised glory. The battlefield answered with silence.